Right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program, Ask a Hospice Social Worker. My name is Emily Hill-Wright, and I'm the Director of Operations at the Merchants House Museum, New York City's only family home to be preserved intact, both inside and out, from the 19th century. Home to the Treadwell family and their Irish servants for nearly 100 years, the Merchants House is complete with the family's original furnishings and personal possessions. As many of you may know, for the last 13 years, the Merchants House has been fighting proposed development next door, construction that is guaranteed to cause irreparable damage to our landmark building and will force us to close the museum to the public for at least 2 years. In 2023, in a shocking betrayal, the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission voted to approve the development in spite of overwhelming and unanimous opposition from the community, preservation organizations, public officials, engineers, and preservation architects. This disastrous vote by the LPC is a warning to every other landmark in New York. If this can happen to the Merchants House, the very first building in Manhattan designated a New York City landmark in 1965, 60 years ago, then every landmark in New York is at risk. Last year, we launched a petition urging the City Hall to step in and protect the Merchants House, which is a city-owned interior and exterior landmark. I'm asking everyone tonight before the talk, please take just 30 seconds to add your name to our petition. I'm posting the direct link right here in the chat. If you click it now, you will be able to sign before our talk even begins. And yes, please do sign even if you don't live in New York City. It's important that the city hears from our supporters from all over. Before we begin, during tonight's program, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions that come up. And I am just delighted to welcome our moderator tonight, thanatologist and Merchants House volunteer, Matilda Garrido. Matilda is a certified thanatologist and holds dual master's degrees in bioethics and thanatology, the study of death, dying, and bereavement. She has worked extensively with the dying and bereaved, and she volunteers at the Merchants House Museum in various capacities, including co-hosting our monthly paranormal roundtable discussion program, In the Spirit of Science. Welcome, Matilda. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Emily. And a huge thank you to you, Carolyn, my colleague and good friend. I'm so glad that you're here. This is the first episode of the second series of Ask a ... which is a series that centers around really helping people get familiar with the work of those who work around death and around dying. It's an effort to demystify death, but also what I find, and I'm sure you find this too, is people have a lot of questions, but actually not a lot of places to ask those questions. So I do want to encourage everyone, use the Q&A feature, please, rather than the chat to ask questions. And we will have time at the end of the show for open Q&A. So Carolyn, welcome. And thank you again so much for your time. Tell us, I already know about your background, but tell everybody a little bit about your background, what you are doing now, and what drew you to this field.
Sure. I'm going to kind of start from a little bit from the beginning, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I had a first career, which I left, and I decided to go into social work school, and I knew I wanted to work with older adults. So you do an internship in graduate school. My first year, I worked with older adults in sort of a housing. Most of them were independent. While I was there, though, we had 2 of them die, and my supervisor at the time, I kind of was involved with them and helped the families, and my supervisor said, "Would you be interested in hospice?" And I was like, "Yeah, wait, what is that?"
Yeah, so many people have that question, right?
And this was 2012, 2011, yeah. So, and you and I know, have talked about hospice has changed a lot since then. So I did my second year internship in hospice only because my supervisor had worked in hospice. And that's when I started interning in hospice, but I really didn't know either what I was getting into. I mean, I knew that it was going to be about end of life, and I knew that it was a good fit for me, but I didn't know exactly what it was. So then I did a whole internship in it, and then it really was a great fit for me. And I'm going to say something I don't think you know. I actually was really hoping to work in pediatric palliative care at that time.
Oh,
And yeah, and well, because it didn't happen, that's why.
right.
And the place that I wanted to work, the hospice absorbed the pediatric
Mhm.
department. And, you know, I got hired to do hospice. And I am just going to add in hospice actually is all ages. I think a lot of people don't know
Mhm.
that. At one point on my caseload, I had an 18-month-old and like a 98-year-old. It really,
Wow.
yeah. And when you work in hospice, I'm going off on a tangent. You
That's
don't
okay.
to take pediatric patients, they identify or ask which clinicians feel comfortable, right? They want
Okay.
first one social, they're hoping to get, but you don't have to. Anyway, I went off on a tangent.
No, that's okay. It's actually a really good point because I think that when people think about hospice and insurance coverage, they immediately go to Medicare, right?
Right.
Because there's so much talk about Medicare covering hospice services, but actually all insurance plans will cover hospice,
And
right?
yes, and I believe in New York State that I don't know if it's the city. I think in New York State, anyone under 18, also, it doesn't matter, you will get covered. They cover anyone under 18 for hospice. And I think some palliative care, but I don't know about it. But hospice is for everyone under 18 is covered in
Hmm.
New York State. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
So
just
anyone can get hospice services and have insurance pay for hospice services. You don't have to be a senior citizen on Medicare.
absolutely, absolutely. The one thing that we would work with, and it might have changed, but with the Affordable Care Act, only because
Hmm.
it really was supposed to be, anyway, that's a whole insurance thing we can get into. But you're right, it absolutely is all insurances. I think I'm just going to add in here, I think one of the reasons it's confusing, and I know we had talked about, so the hospice Medicare benefit was passed by Congress in 1982. And yes,
Hmm.
it means that Medicare covered it, but it also just means that that's the governing body that sets up some of the regulations, making sure the social worker goes,
Hmm.
making sure the person gets care. So I think people also refer to Medicare only because that's where we want to make sure people are getting pain management and that kind of thing, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
that brings up another interesting point, which about hospice really being community-based care, which is in order to get for agencies that provide hospice services to get reimbursement, 5% of patient care hours must be provided by volunteers. So
Yeah.
the idea is to bring the community into supporting people who are at the end of life. So
So
continue with your story because you're now on a sort of you're going in a different direction now. You have left active hospice work. Um,
yeah, I did hospice for 9 years in Brooklyn, which I loved, and we can talk more about it. And I
mhm,
did it through COVID and through the worst part of COVID, which we don't have to go into. And then yeah, so then I went into social workers. LMSW social workers are therapists in training. We have to take another test, which I passed, and then you become a clinical social worker, and then you
mhm,
become a therapist. So I started working in grief. And now I'm actually having therapists who work under me or work for me as well. So
mhm,
specialize in grief. We specialize in all forms of grief. Also, certainly we can help people through end of life. I just hired a young woman who worked with folks with cancer, so she can work with recent diagnosis. And then we can talk more about it later too. But now I do
okay,
therapy and grief counseling. Yeah.
okay. And we will share your website so people can get in touch with you if they want to. So there's so much mystery about hospice, but really there's a lot of mystery about what the various like clinicians in each role in hospice do. So tell us a little bit about exactly what a hospice social worker will do for a patient and a family, because hospice is really, it's for the patient, but it's also for the family. So when a family is referred to hospice and accepts a hospice placement, right? And hospice is not necessarily a physical location. You can receive hospice care at home as well. But once you accept the placement, you will be met with an entire team of people focusing not only on your physical comfort, but also your spiritual and your emotional comfort. So tell us a little bit about what hospice social workers do and what they can provide to patients.
Yeah, and I do want to say, I also feel like New York City is really a lot of home hospice. We really don't,
Hmm.
and I've heard in some other places they have a little bit more of like a hospice home. And New York, I just maybe because of like housing, we most people in New York are at home. I just wanted to add that, as you had said.
Yeah, you can receive hospice services in a hospital
Certain ones,
and
yeah.
in a nursing home or a skilled nursing facility as well.
Yes, because a skilled nursing facility is considered their home. So
Hmm.
yeah. But so this is a great question. I love what you asked. And so it's also because I do love the idea, the strength and beauty of an interdisciplinary approach. It's so
Yeah.
important. And so we're going to kind of start from the beginning. So like you said, it signs the paperwork and they're accepted onto hospice. And going back to the Medicare benefit or Medicare, which is really just saying whoever's on hospice with whichever insurance, the social worker, the nurse and the social worker have to come in. I think it's within 48 hours. I'm not sure. But the point
Okay.
that we have to come in right away, right? And we come in for our initial assessment, often we'll come together. And what the social worker, from the very beginning, what they do is all social workers are trained in what's called a biopsychosocial spiritual. It's a holistic approach, right?
Hmm.
And spiritual also includes religion and culture, right?
Right.
And we're in people's homes and we're in people's communities. We're in their environment usually, right? Hospice social workers do a biopsychosocial, spiritual, financial, and some of them now are adding sexual if appropriate, and sometimes it actually is because this can be important to people, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's a holistic approach that we're doing a whole assessment.
Okay.
And it can be, I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but once we do that, we're finding strengths, weaknesses, what people need help with, and then we pull in other people. We might need a
Mhm.
spiritual care counselor. This might be something more for the nurses, or it could be a music therapist, or they might need something specific from the social worker, which I'll talk about, or they might
Okay.
need you. So when we do our whole holistic approach, we're kind of seeing who else needs to be a part of this, right? Or maybe who else is a part of it. They might have a strong church community, or
Hmm.
what are the strengths that they do have? So I was going to say more, but did you want to jump in?
Yeah, no. So I have a question. So you are the first point of contact for the family or the patient. So you're coming in, you're doing this intake, you're doing this evaluation, you're getting also feedback from the patient, right, about what they would like. Like if a patient says, I'm not sure how I'm going to pay for all the supplies, or I don't know how I'm going to pay for the care that I need and things like that. You can help them figure out and find resources, and then you will bring in team members as appropriate. So hospice social workers are really the front line.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we usually go with the nurse. It's the nurse and
Okay.
the social worker together.
Hmm.
But sometimes, I mean, the nurse does her assessment, but for some people, depending on their diagnosis, some diagnosis, like they have a lot of pain or they might have a lot of
Hmm.
shortness of
Hmm.
breath. They're worried that they're going to suffer as they die, or the
Yes.
family is worried. So in that case, after that initial assessment, the social worker would gather the medical team and say, hey, they're asking about a physical question, but it's emotional and spiritual.
Mm.
They're really worried because this person has always had shortness of breath. We need to really, I mean, some people might say, oh, I'm worried what happens at end of life, but this is different because they've had this symptom, right? So,
Right.
so we would really pull in, I mean, the nurse might hear it, but I'm like, no, no, no. We need to pull in the family, any other caregivers, the doctor, the nurse, and we're going to do a little team meeting to facilitate.
Hmm.
And then the family can, so that's when I was saying an extra meeting with the family. So yeah, we're like,
Yeah.
and you use the right, I love this word, resources, right? So So hospice social workers, like I said, we're therapists in training, so we do some coping skills. We do connect people to resources or referrals. So there's a number of things. And like you said, it could be all. It could be they do want to talk about grief, their anticipatory grief, and they're worried about something financial. And there are different things, right? So
Right.
so we assess for all of those. Yeah.
So Carolyn, when you're first speaking with people, so let's go sort of back to the beginning of the process. When someone accepts a hospice designation and hospice services, they really are accepting the fact that death is real and it may not be imminent within 48 hours, but it's happening sooner rather than later, right?
So can I jump in? Because I'm
Sure.
not necessarily. So
Okay.
sometimes people will say, a caregiver might say, like, don't use the word hospice. Can you use the word palliative care? Or
Mhm.
sometimes people will say, which it is true that if you have someone who keeps getting hospitalized and the hospital's like, there's nothing we can do for you, hospice
Mhm.
is the right program for them. That doesn't mean that they've accepted their dying. It just means the care at home is really the appropriate care for them. Like
I
the
see.
hospital's like, this person is getting towards end of life. We're not fixing anything.
Yeah.
So that is true. But it's not always true that they're really accepting of it.
Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah, I hear that. I mean,
Yeah.
actually, I have worked with families who we've been sort of instructed, don't mention the word hospice. Um,
Oh,
so
can I,
people
can
are
I,
not,
can
yeah,
I,
no, jump in at any time.
well, we were working with a family and the the person came on hospice already very deteriorated. And as
Mm-hmm.
part of the biopsychosocial spiritual, the social worker is the one who asks about DNR, DNI, DNH. We want to know exactly, like you said, what are the person's wishes? And
Mm-hmm.
we actually fill out a form. The social worker does a MOLST, which is a very detailed form of like how
Right.
right? And then
Right.
the doctor signs it. So we, like you said, we want to know exactly what are the patient's wishes for end of life, and do they have funeral plans? And then if they don't, the social worker, it's our job to help them, connect them to a funeral home and make sure that those plans are
Oh, good.
in place. And I want to just add one other thing so people know, in New York State, when someone dies, you never call 911, and the person,
If they're on hospice, you
if
never
they're in
call
hospice, sorry.
911. I mean, yeah, if someone dies very unexpectedly,
Thank
you
you.
need to call 911. But when someone is on hospice, they've been receiving hospice care, you do
Thank you.
not call 911. Why? I mean, I know the answer, but please explain.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. One, I actually used to say to family, the person in New York actually doesn't technically need to be, what's the word, proclaimed or dead. But
Mm-hmm.
one of us will be there with you. We're happy, and often it's the
Mm.
social worker, the spiritual care counselor. We will come to be with you, but it most likely won't even be pronounced is the word, pronounced, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so one of us will come and then we can call the funeral home or you can, and then the funeral home comes directly, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we just need to know the time of death, right?
Okay.
So wait, I just went on a tangent. But the social worker does the paperwork. As you were saying, what are your wishes? Have you talked about what funeral plans you want with your family? And we help facilitate that. Or, the family might say, oh, we want to know what song they want, or, so we
Mm-hmm.
often be a part of that conversation as well. That's something else that we do help with.
So, Carolyn, do you ever, when you're working with patients or families, um, do you ever deal with death doulas? And if so, how do you and the death doula communicate about the patient's needs and where might the two of you intersect? As you know, I teach a course at the University of Vermont that trains death doulas, and I believe some of our students might be in the audience tonight or will certainly be watching the replay. And this is going to be something that is very of interest to them, also to families that are considering hiring a death doula. I mean, so how does a death doula intersect with hospice, and how can they work together to better the patient experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really good if they, and I do think sometimes the team could also refer a doula to also, you know.
Okay, if the family wants a doula, the team might know of connections.
Yeah.
So to the students that are out there, um, find out about hospice providers in your area.
Absolutely. And you know, there was a private hire aide who we used who really is a lot like a death doula. She's amazing. And then I became
Mhm.
friends with her. But you know, she had certain strengths that we recognized. And so
Mhm.
I mean, I'm gonna say we had a very, so I'm just going to give an example. We had a really, really difficult case. It was a lot of social work. I had to do a lot. And so we had this doula in there, and she was able to, I mean, she really was our eyes and ears helping the
Mhm.
patient. The person who was caregiving had a mental illness, and I
Uh,
had to really figure out, it was a lot of work to figure out what to do with this patient who was very deteriorated. And the person was like, the caregiver was actually wouldn't let anyone in the home except for me and
mm,
just one nurse, and the nurse was like going on vacation. It was like a really, so we had this doula who really was able to like be on the inside and help us and really help.
mhm.
So
Mhm.
worked with the social worker and the nurse, but really was able to be like, help me. Okay, you're there. This is, you know, and I would keep her in the loop and kind of let her know. And then I was able to make arrangements. So I let her know, hey, this is, you know, what's happening. So
Right.
helping to be a part of the team, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I am actually hearing more and more that hospice agencies are retaining death doulas to be a part of the team. So that's an additional support for the family.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
so I do think though often different death doulas have different strengths or
Mhm.
maybe things they might be leaning towards, right?
Right. Their focus and their passion.
Right,
Everyone has a passion in some area. For some
right,
people, it's legacy work. You
right,
know, for other people, it's more project management, and they'll help you with getting all of the paperwork together and things like that. For others, it's more spiritual support.
right. So like I know Amy had worked with when we Amy Cunningham.
Amy Cunningham, who was on
And
last season's Ask a Funeral Director, which you can get on YouTube.
she's wonderful. I've known her for years. So she
Yeah.
a doula helping her, but that, which was wonderful. It really was actually when the person died, they did this beautiful ritual. It was
Hmm.
beautiful. So that's what, but this doula came in at that point, right? So
Right.
so I do think a lot of it depends on, like you said, what's their, I'm using strength or their interest and where, like I said, so when the social worker comes in to say, okay, what does this family need? You know, we need to know, okay,
Hmm.
doula really needs to be there because this was a young person, a younger person that,
Oh, uh-huh.
so they needed a lot of support. Okay, well, if we need more support at the time of death, this doula is the person to help with that. Or this one helps with, like I was saying, that one I really needed someone who was amazing with being able to stay calm while this caregiver,
Hmm.
you know, but so like I said, people have different strengths, right?
Right, right. So as a hospice social worker, once you do the intake and you've set up the services, how often are you going back and seeing the patient and the family? Generally.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we would do acuity, right? And that the acuity was based on the biopsychosocial. So some families needed, in the beginning, needed me once a week, or if there was,
Hmm.
or the person was very close to, they weren't yet imminently dying, but we knew it was going to be a very short time. Um,
Hmm.
Pediatric case, or I had a young woman who was dying. It was one of the last cases I did in hospice. She had a little kid. I'm getting very emotional.
Yeah.
And it was very hard. She had a little kid, and I was there in the beginning, I was there 2 or 3 times a week, and then at the end, I was there almost every day. But there are other
Yeah.
people I see once a month. I'd see one,
Hmm.
and the family was okay. That often tended to be a much older person. Often that was someone with dementia who had all the paperwork had been done years ago. They had the aids and things had been in place. So
Hmm.
acute, so what I like to say about the biopsychosocial is that we work with everybody individually, and we continue to work with everybody individually. Now,
So it's what the patient and the family needs, and I keep saying patient and family because I
yeah,
really want to stress that hospice takes care of the family, because frequently the family is really struggling too with everything that's going on, and they may need that sort of spiritual, emotional care as well. So you
so
provide for both.
to your point, a lot of times I did a lot of work with the caregiver, and I
Hmm.
often said to them, we, meaning the social worker, we support the people who support the patient. And so
Right.
you're right, a lot of times, like if I often went with the nurse, she'd go to the patient and ask, are you comfortable? Da, 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 and I would go to the caregiver. And certainly if
Hmm.
the person was getting towards end of life, right? Or
Right.
even if they were speaking less, they could, they were too tired. I mean, some patients, I might only have a conversation with them 1 or 2 times, and either
Hmm.
they'd so deteriorate, they'd start to deteriorate. So you are absolutely right. Much of the work that I did was with the caregiver, and like you said, the spiritual care counselor, we were all there for. And even I would sometimes sit with the nurse if they were explaining something. I would say to the caregiver, did you understand what she said? Because I don't know if I did. That was really good.
Uh-huh.
And try, so we really had to make sure, you're right, we do a lot, like I said, the social worker and often the spiritual care counselor, we are really there for the caregiver. You're absolutely right.
Hmm. Hmm.
Great point.
And again, just to stress, hospice is always covered by insurance. So this is a benefit that is available to everybody. And kind of getting back to what you said in the beginning about, actually, we were offline when we were talking about this, but that you've been to like public housing and homes on Park Avenue. Like hospice is what we call an ecumenical provider. Like hospice is open to everyone, and everyone takes advantage of hospice services. But what are what do you find are the barriers to people going for hospice? Is it that it is not recommended early enough by the doctors? Is it a lack of understanding about what hospice is, whether it is covered by insurance or not covered by insurance? What do you find uh, prevents people from taking advantage of this wonderful support system earlier? Because as we know, technically you can be on hospice if you have a prognosis of 6 months, but most people don't come onto hospice until the last 5 days of their life. So they're missing this months and months of focus on quality of life. And that's very sad, I think. What's your thoughts?
So I agree with you. I do wonder if, this idea of when people come on hospice, this is just the end. And to your point, I don't think people realize all of the benefits. And I do want
Mm-hmm.
to kind of what you were saying. You said something before that I remembered. So I also say to people, hospice, like we're saying, you get all this care. You can, I mean, we had a patient, we had a daughter who she said, I'm not crazy about hospice, but I just can't keep dragging my mom to the hospital and to these doctor's appointments. It's killing
Mm-hmm.
both of us. And so
Mm-hmm.
bringing the care into the home. And then when she saw, like you said, it's of course you get the nurse, you get the social worker, and I help with so many also paperwork. I've helped many caregivers do their FMLA, so I can do
Mm-hmm.
therapy and paperwork, right? You can get the spiritual care counselor. And I also said, if you want the hospital bed, there's many supplies that we also
Right.
pay for. So there's all these
Mm-hmm.
benefits. I say to people, if the nurses have this little tablet, if they can order it, you don't have to pay for it. Ask the nurse before you go on Amazon. So you're
Mm-hmm.
really getting all these services, like you're saying. And one of the questions going back to the biopsychosocial spiritual is, how do you want to make the most of this time right now? What's important?
Right.
seeing your granddaughter. You don't want to be in pain when what are your goals? We use that word. What are your goals? Both to the patient and to the caregiver, right?
Yeah, I think that's really important. What you're saying is that the focus is totally on quality of life, not just pain relief, not just physical pain relief, but what's important to you? What's your wish? What do you want to do? Like, what do you want to feel comfortable enough that you can do in this time that you do have left? It's really focused on helping people enjoy life. You know, it's not just like, let's get you through these last months, which might be tricky health wise and pain wise, and you might get, feel very depressed or whatever. It's more about like actually just exactly what you said, making the most of the time.
Yeah, I'm remembering, I would just want to tell a few stories.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, years ago, we had a patient who was British and had been a Shakespearean actress or something. And one of the other things we do often with volunteers, or it could be a doula, I found one of our volunteers who would sit and read Shakespeare, which thank God, because I wasn't going to do it.
Uh-huh.
And she loved it. She really, and this was real quality of life for this woman, right? And to your point, though, she wasn't that old, and she had these two young nieces who were they were in their 20s, but that's very young to be taking care of a dying person. And so
Right.
I was doing so much work with these young women who did an amazing job, but it's really hard. And
Mm-hmm.
yet we were able to give a lot of quality of life to this Shakespearean actress I get.
Oh, I love it.
So to your point, like there were also times we didn't have a music therapist. And so I would go with our spiritual care counselor, and we both like to sing. So we would do our session, we would do our work, and then we would sing. We would sing a song, and then the caregiver would join in, and often we would play music and do these kinds of things. So
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to
Yeah.
add those things.
We have a question, and I see, thank you, Sakita. I'm going to save it for the end, but your question actually prompted me to think of something else, which is, although hospice does not provide round-the-clock care, when someone is actively dying, they will provide, at least the hospice that I work with, I'm on this team, as well as the bereavement work that I do, what's called vigil service, where they will ask for volunteers to come and sit with a patient. It could even be overnight, right? So that if the family needs to take a break, but they don't want the patient to be alone, if the patient is in the hospital, or they don't want to stay up all night with the patient, but they don't want the patient to be alone. So that's called vigil sitting, and hospices do provide vigil sitting as well as an added benefit to families.
And correct me if I'm wrong. Well, I wanted to say something else about doulas, but I thought maybe they've changed it, that a lot of hospices do vigil sitting in skilled nursing facilities, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
They'll do it in homes, in hospitals, in skilled nursing facilities, even in inpatient hospices, they will provide vigil services. The idea, it's part of what's called the NODA, No One Dies Alone movement.
Okay.
So it's part of a movement to make sure that no one dies alone if they don't want to die alone, or the family doesn't want them to. So that's another really important consideration, because it can take somebody, once someone does begin transitioning, it can take time, right? It can take like 4 or 5 days sometimes for someone to actively transition. And as a family member, you need to care for yourself too. So again, this is the time when hospice will try to provide round the clock compassionate care for the patient and the family, just so family members can get a break.
And it's very hard on families, like you say, at this, and I'm going to add one thing to that. Yes. So I think during COVID, they weren't sending in, that's why I got confused, into homes. They weren't sending vigil volunteers, but things have changed.
Yeah.
So which is good news. And I'm just going to add something, because I say to families, when someone to this point when they are so the nurse and someone from the team comes every single day when someone is imminently dying. So we change our frequency. If we were coming once a week or whatever, we change it. One of us comes every single day. And if I know that sometimes two of us will come a day in one day if we know they really need our services, right?
Yeah.
So you're right. The team really comes in at that time because the acuity has changed. So we're all there. So that's a good thing to bring up. But I'm just going to jump in and add one thing, which has to do more with the dying process, which I know did you want to stay on more hospice, or can I add one thing about the dying process?
Please go ahead, because I was going to then ask you, one of my next questions was, because so many of the people that are members and interested in the Merchants House are also interested in what I would call, I'm going to use the word paranormal, but this is not a paranormal experience in hospice. But I have observed, and I'm sure you have too, because many, many end-of-life workers have observed, that there are unexplainable, commonly shared phenomena that happen to people or happen with people at the end of life. Like, for instance, talking a lot about having to get on the train. Where is the taxi? They're going on a journey, stuff like that. So do you want to talk a little bit about that sort of more mystical stuff that you've seen working with people at end of life?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, it's true. Definitely heard that same language. And I thought I'd share. I don't know if I put this in my book, which I'm redoing anyway. But so when you first start in hospice, you shadow a number of different disciplines. And when I first went, I shadowed my social work supervisor, and he took me into homes where it was like, okay, there's a lot of social work. Okay, they didn't have funeral plans. We got to talk, or they weren't DNI or DNR. And I'm like, okay. And then a nurse took me like the next day. And she was a lovely person. And we walked into this home and the mood was totally different. It was not like what my supervisor, which he appropriately wanted me to be, okay, what resource? No. Okay. It just was different. And we walk in, and this patient was in a hospital bed in the living room. Well, actually, her husband opened the door, and he was just very somber. I could just tell, you could, the mood was different. And he very quietly, he opened the door. He acknowledged, the nurse. We walked in. She was laying in the bed. And I was new to hospice. And this woman was staring up, and I think it was a caregiver who said this. I don't think it was a professional who later said, it's almost like she has 1 foot in our world and 1 foot in the world, right? Which I thought was a great way of describing it. And this woman was looking, but she was more looking at something, she wasn't staring off at my face. And the nurse gently took her hand and very, talked to her. And then she kind of came back to our world and made eye contact. And, the nurse said, "Are you okay?" And she's, "Yeah, I'm okay." And then the nurse and then it's like she went from one world to another, right?
Yeah.
And that was my very first experience.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful, actually. It's beautiful to witness that.
Beautiful.
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. And so, and that was true often, right? This is, so, we see this a lot. We see this. I was going to add one thing, but did you want to say something?
I wanted to say another thing that I have observed, and I find frequently this is actually very confusing to families, is dying people will talk of being visited by people who have died before, like their husband or their mother or whatever. And for families, it can be very distressing because they think, oh my goodness, is this yet another symptom of like things going downhill? But actually, we don't know if this is a hallucination or not. I mean, it happened to both of my parents. And generally, when it happens, it is very, very comforting for the patient. And it is almost like they are being welcoming, they're being accompanied on their transition, people who've gone before that they want to see again, right? Like they generally don't get visits from people that they don't want to see again. But
Right.
it is like this sort of enveloping feeling that I find. And I knew enough about it. This happened with both of my parents. When they were describing this, I wasn't afraid because I knew that it was a commonly shared phenomenon, and I was happy for them. But again, sometimes it can be very confusing for families. And if there's anybody out there who has ever experienced this or is currently experiencing this, the the way to handle it is to actually ask questions. How did that make you feel? Oh, I'm so glad you saw her again, because this seems to be part of a healing journey that the patient is going on. It's sort of like, as you say, as they get closer, they're sort of lifted up and supported by these kind of unseen forces. And this phenomena is universal. It's described constantly with different people with different belief systems and stuff.
Yeah, and you hit the nail. And it is different than hallucinations, but in either case, a social worker would use the words, "Oh, do you feel comforted by this person?"
Hmm.
Or, that kind of language, right? So, I mean, you really kind of said that. That's just the very, I don't know, social work word, but same thing,
Uh-huh.
right? It's like, "Oh, are you comforted?" What I was going to add, which is
Yeah,
connected to,
yeah.
is that I have found, I mean, many, many times, people tend to go back to their primary family and even their primary
Mhm.
language. And so,
Mm,
I mean,
mhm.
I get sometimes they would see their husband, but very often it's either my dad, my mom, or
Mhm.
they'll think their daughter is their mom. And there's something about going back to that primary
Uh,
childhood. And I worked with a very diverse population, and it was
mhm.
not uncommon that, let's say mom is dying and the adult children would say, she hasn't lived in her home country for 50 years. We were born here. We don't even speak that. She hasn't spoken, my dad died 20 years ago. I didn't even know she still knew, Spanish or Arabic or whatever.
Mhm.
Went back. It just seems like they went back to this primary time, this,
Yeah.
um, yeah, and maybe that's why they're seeing their, parents or something. But it is comforting. Yes,
Mhm.
I think it makes, it's this comforting kind of feeling. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to get to a question that we have that Sakita had put in. Um, Can you give more examples of how you helped the families too, as this was an essential part of it for my sisters and I who were caring for my mom and Sakita has shared that her mom had mild dementia during those last. So how would you, and because it's, becoming a larger problem, right? How do you support families when a patient has dementia, and the patient may not necessarily even be aware that you're around or aware, like, how do you help the families decode, is she in pain? Is she not in pain? Is she getting what she needs? And things like that.
So that is a great question. And we would have special training on pain, right? So
Mm-hmm.
really it's like, is the person grimacing? Do they seem to be tense? Are they holding? You have to really try to read the body cues for those kinds of things, trying to
Mm-hmm.
really, truly be in touch like with their physical, kind of what's going on physically to know if it's pain. Or I know though sometimes it's hard because people can just be agitated, right? And
Mm-hmm.
agitate them at that time. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
So helping the family identify, really better learn how
Yeah.
to support their loved one, the patient, when the patient can't necessarily verbalize what they need, sort of decoding symbols like that.
Yeah, so that's one thing. The other thing, and she may have already known this, but I also say to people sometimes, and I just in general, people need to know that it can be very frightening,
Mm-hmm.
to have when you have Alzheimer's or dementia, because if you can't
Mm-hmm.
remember something. So I remember when I was getting trained, I didn't have this patient, but I was trained that there was a patient who they had to put towels or something over all the mirrors in the home, or cover up the mirrors, because this patient, when they looked in the mirror, they didn't know it was a mirror and they thought it was a stranger in the home.
Oh,
Which is
because they
terrible.
didn't recognize
They
themselves.
didn't reckon, right, or if someone else,
Mhm.
it felt like another person. And so it just, sometimes there's a lot of, it can be very fearful, right? So can we work from that lens? I would just kind of bring that lens. Okay, it's scary. And if mom doesn't
Right.
want to talk to me, that's okay. That's okay.
Mhm, mhm,
I
mhm.
want her to be okay. And like you said, in these situations, I worked mostly often with the caregiver, right?
Right.
Because
Mhm.
it was almost too much. You didn't want to bring another person in with
Right.
I mean, the nurse would have to, and she would, but I might not be helpful to that to that patient. It's another, okay, what are we going to do for the caregiver, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
so that's a
Right.
really good example of that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be really tough though. So that anyway, that was the lens we would
Mhm.
often use, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So it really is like, I mean, the idea is that supporting the family emotionally and spiritually is supporting the patient. So if the nurses and the doctors are taking care of the patient's pain or those other physical needs, the social worker and the spiritual care worker. And let's just talk about the spiritual care worker for 1 second. So that's going to be a, a a clergy person, right? A pastoral care person, but that doesn't mean they can meet anyone where in any religious observance, right? So you'll have a spiritual care person, the chaplain, they're called the hospice chaplain, and they will come and meet with to talk about spiritual issues, and they are trained right in a multitude of different philosophies and different practices. So even if that spiritual care provider is themselves a Christian or themselves are Jewish, they are trained in the customs and beliefs of most major religions. So they can come in and provide that kind of like direct spiritual support.
Absolutely. And that's why I really try to use, so they are, even if they are, you're right, they're supposed to be or they deliver non-denominational care. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why I really use the word spiritual care counselor versus chaplain. Um,
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I know in other parts of the country, people do say chaplain, but it, tends to have a particular denomination, right? So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and so I say spiritual care, we work with everybody in an individualized way, like you said, right? So spiritual care can look like, oh, the social worker's coming with me today and with a spiritual care counselor, we're going to sing a song. It can
Mm-hmm.
look like different things. And then I worked with a non-denominational spiritual care counselor who would pray with people. Certain people did want to pray,
Mm-hmm.
and she knew some of those prayers, Um,
Mm-hmm.
so we really tried to meet the needs of the person, and I'm going to say, what does spiritual care mean to them? Because it can mean
Yes.
something different to everybody, right?
Right. Yeah. Like as a doula, when I have worked privately as a doula, and I always tell my students this, people love to tell you about their traditions and their beliefs about end of life and the afterlife. So just ask. If you don't know, just ask,
Mhm.
and that can lead to like a much larger conversation about how you can be present and support and what's meaningful for that family. And it's going to be very different depending if someone is observant and actively practicing. It's going to be very different, right?
Yeah. And I also say, so there's culture, and then there's family culture, and then
Yes.
here in
Hmm.
New York, we also, well, I work with a number of first generation, and they
Hmm.
have a slightly different feeling about their culture, religion than the parent might who came. So it's very nuanced even within a family.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I remember I worked with a couple, the husband was dying and he died, and they actually within the couple were two different religions and different philosophies. So it was really
Hmm.
interesting when it came time for his funeral memorial wake. She ended up not doing what he wanted.
Uh-huh.
He said, well, it's actually for me, not for him, which I was
Hmm.
fine. So it's interesting what really, you know, within a family or in a couple, right?
Yeah.
So asking those questions, yeah.
Yeah. Julie asks, one of the doula videos I watched, it was suggested that at the very end, it's best not to hold a person's hand, which potentially is keeping that person grounded instead of letting their spirit go. What are your thoughts or experience on this?
So
Thank you, Julie.
yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And I'm going to tell a story about my grandmother. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully this will be helpful. And I know if you're kind of coming in if you're a doula or a vigil volunteer, you might not know the person's personality, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there is something sometimes to, I think, giving people their space, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
can see where this is coming from, that what the video is saying, you know, like maybe they really do need their that space to let go, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um I mean, I hadn't really thought of that, but I really can see that. I really
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um feel that I'm trying to be more articulate about it, that I think so I'm kind of shifting, but I'm not, is one of the things is when we do this work, where's the place where we show up and bring love and care? And then where's the place where we also have to let the person do what they need to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where is it
Yeah.
not right? And I almost think that maybe she's kind of asking this question is like, okay, where's the place of like, I have to be grounded and let go. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So
I think, right, like, because I'm sure you've witnessed this, keeping in mind that, like, sometimes families will sit vigil for 5 days, and then the person who's sitting will go out to smoke a cigarette or get Chinese food, and the person dies at that moment, right? Like, so some people don't want to die in front of other people. And in my experience, people do it their way, like, I mean, unless it's a traumatic accident and they don't have a choice about the circumstance, but like,
yeah,
people will die with people or they will die alone. And there's always a moment when they're not attended to, right? So people will, like, this is just another kind of
yeah,
beautiful thing that I think and find about end of life is that it becomes in the last days, hours, minutes, an organic process. It's like it's something has taken over, and we just have to allow people know how to die. Animals know how to die, right? Like they have a whole thing. They'll go behind a sofa, or they'll go out, or they will sleep next to their favorite animal or their favorite human and then die. Then so animals know how to die, but people also know how to die. And to the extent that they are allowed, and this is, I think, the problem with so much medical intervention at the end of life, right? Like, to the extent that they are allowed, they will die the way that we wish. And we may feel bad. Oh no, I left and then she died. I feel terrible. She was alone. If you were there for 5 days and you stepped out for 3 minutes and she died, like that, she did that on purpose. Like that's what she wanted, right?
100%. And that's what happened
Mm-hmm.
with my Nana, who
Mm-hmm.
loved her. And with Nana was just very vain. She was very, and I think she just didn't want my mom to see her die.
Yeah.
She was like,
Yeah.
so if you knew my Nana, you would know that that's what Nana.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom sat there for like 3 days or something. I don't know. And the minute my mom went to get coffee, Nana. So you're right. You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. And you had said something else that I was gonna but it is true. It's very true that there are often people who, yeah, they want to, that's the way they want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And you had said something else and now I'm forgetting. But
I
exactly,
just wanted to respond to Julie about holding the hand. So
yeah.
we teach and we're taught that you will put your hand underneath somebody's rather than on top of it, because if you put your hand underneath, that person can move their hand away if they want to. So I mean, that's assuming the person has the ability to move their hand. um, I don't know if that keeps someone too grounded to transition. I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I think it really would depend on the person, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Some people want to hold someone's hand when they're dying.
I think it's all different. I mean, I remember
Mhm.
I was called in first thing in the morning. A patient who I hadn't even seen came onto hospice, I think imminently dying. I went into the home. There was a lot of people there. First thing is I go into the bedroom to see the patient. Certainly she is actively dying. So I
Mhm.
look around, I come out and I'm talking to one of like the son, do you have plans, da 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 da. The aide comes out and is like, I think she died. So then we all go back into the room.
Mhm.
And I mean, she didn't know me. Maybe she was like, get the social worker out of here. And I had never
Yeah.
met her before,
Yeah.
you know?
Mhm.
And she died, in the time we walked out to, so things just, like you said, things really just happen at this time. And this is what I wanted to add to what you said. And in my private practice, I work with this, but even in hospice, this guilt, right? With my mom, I stayed, or the person died and I wasn't there. And this even happened sometimes when someone was on hospice and the person did great care, and then they went out to dinner one time, or they had to go to do
Yeah.
something, and so one of the things, of course, we'd say is like, maybe she was waiting for you to leave. She was trying to
Yeah.
protect you. She didn't want you.
Mhm.
And I say to people, it's the care you did for so long. She knew you
Yeah.
loved her. She knew you cared for her. And so, we work with that. And now often in my private practice, that's something we have to work with too. So I just
Yeah.
put that out there.
So, Carolyn, we have just a very few minutes left. I want to ask you, tell us about what you're doing now.
Okay, yeah. So we had started so I went into private practice, and now I've opened the Center for Integrated Grief. Um,
Mhm.
we do specialize in grief counseling. We specialize in all forms of loss. Certainly people who've been on hospice, sudden death. We also do a lot of non-death losses as well, loss of culture, loss of identity, divorce, miscarriage,
Mhm.
these kinds of things. Um, and we do a lot of different, we also do shadow work and parts work, which all
Mhm.
about.
Mhm.
I have a Spanish speaking and a Chinese speaking therapist. Um,
Mhm.
and we do take Medicare and a couple other insurances. So
Okay.
just want to put that out there.
Mhm.
Really we're trying to be very much in the community and to reach many people, certainly around grief and loss, and then depression, of course, as well.
Right. Right. And you also do pet loss.
And what's that?
You also do pet loss.
And we do pet loss. Yeah, I was going to say, and I can connect you to an amazing pet loss specialist.
That would be me,
Which,
right?
yes, I'm very excited.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I love this. It's such a natural transition for you too, I think, like to go from actively working with families to supporting after a death.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. And sometimes we do have to go back to the death event and talk about that.
Mhm, mhm. Right, because people do carry trauma from that. People who have witnessed it, or if it's a prolonged illness, have been through accompanying the patient through that. There are usually a lot of residual feelings. And also in cases of sudden death, that's a whole different ball game. But you also provide help and guidance for that in the Center for Integrated Grief.
Mhm.
All
Yeah,
different kinds of losses, very different losses.
yeah. Grief and trauma. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's Emily.
Thank you both so much. This was so
Carolyn, thank
wonderful.
you
Yes,
so
I
much for your
cannot thank you
generosity and your
enough.
time. Thank you.
At the Merchant's House, we talk a lot, especially in October, about sort of what death was like in the 19th century.
Hmm.
And it's been such a wonderful thing for us to be able to talk to experts like you and to have Matilda help to navigate these conversations so that we can really think about the ways that the past is informing how we do things now. And um,
Hmm.
we're really very thankful at the museum that we're able to host these conversations. So thank you both so
Yeah.
much for being here.
Yeah, Emily, thank you for enabling us to have these conversations. Because for Carolyn and I and everyone who works in the death care field, we know the importance of having them, and really want to reduce fear around people sharing and experiencing what they're experiencing. And again, Carolyn, thank you so much for your time and your generosity. It is always a pleasure to talk to you, and I really, really thank you so much. And if anybody wants to get in touch with Carolyn, her website is on the chat, and also her YouTube channel is on the chat. She's got lots of great videos.
Yes, and we hope to see everyone next month for the next in our series, Ask a Cemeterian with Gabrielle Gatto, Director of Programs at Greenwood Cemetery. So we're excited for that conversation in March. Tickets to all of our upcoming events, both in-person tours and virtual events, can be found on our website at merchantshouse.org. The museum is currently open to visitors on Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and we have options for both guided and self-guided visits. So you can visit merchantshouse.org for tickets and more information. Tonight's program was presented free of charge, but we do hope that you will consider making a donation or joining us as a member to support our future programming. Recordings of all our free virtual talks can be found on our YouTube page. Visit us at youtube.com/merchantsHouseMuseum. The recording of tonight's program will be up on the YouTube page tomorrow. So if you want to rewatch or pass it on to anyone who wasn't able to join tonight, you'll be able to do that tomorrow. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. And thank you again, especially to Matilda and Carolyn, for this just wonderful talk tonight. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you again, Carolyn.
Thank you.